مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. للمرة الأولى منذ حوالي 4 سنوات كان يتم إيقاف الحكومة الفيدرالية عن العمل. لماذا؟ لأن الكونغرس لم يتمكن من القيام بواحدة من مسؤولياته الأساسية، وهي التصديق على 12 مشروع قانون من القوانين الضرورية للإنفاق من أجل تمويل الإدارات والوكالات الحكومية. إذا تم الإيقاف سيتوقف جزء كبير من واشنطن عن العمل، على الرغم من أن الخدمات الأساسية ستستمر، وسيبقى مئات الآلاف من موظفي الحكومة في منازلهم. ما هي الآثار المترتبة على توقف الحكومة عن العمل؟ وكيف سيؤثر ذلك في الاقتصاد الأمريكي؟ وكما ينبغي على الأمريكيين العاديين إعداد ميزانياتهم شهريا، فلماذا يصعب على المشرعين في بلدنا إعداد ميزانية للحكومة الوطنية وإيجاد الأموال اللازمة لدفع فواتيراتنا؟ لمناقشة احتمال تأثير توقف الحكومة الفيدرالية عن العمل على الاقتصاد الأمريكي، خاصة مع خروجنا من الركود الناجم عن كوفيد، يسعدني أن أرحب بلجنة من الخبراء المتميزين ريتشارد فيغ، سارة فارس, and Russell Berman. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Remarkably, the United States government may soon shut down. Why? Because Congress, which only has a handful of constitutional responsibilities, is not fulfilling one of its most important, to authorize and appropriate money for the government to operate. Let's take a closer look with Richard Vague, Russell Berman, and Sarah Ferris. Sarah, let me start with you. You keep a close eye on Congress. Let me start with a big question. How likely is a government shutdown?
So I would say we have all of the ingredients for a shutdown. I've witnessed a few in my time, and what you really need to have in order for Congress to be headed towards a shutdown, you need usually divided government. You need a couple of really big outstanding items that the two parties don't agree to. In this case, right now, we're talking about spending cuts. We're talking about border policies. And another ingredient this year is really, really small margins in Congress. So this has led, particularly on the Republican side in the House, there is a lot of dysfunction. They're not able to get spending bills, even that their own party drafted, across the finish line. So you have those three ingredients, and you have most people on Capitol Hill thinking that a shutdown is extremely likely this year.
Extremely likely. So Russell, why does this happen? How rare is this in American history?
It's pretty common in the last 10 years or so. Anytime, as Sarah mentioned, that we see divided government, really this would be the third presidential administration in a row that we've seen a government shutdown. And to her point, I was talking to a Democrat the other day who said that he put the chances of a shutdown at 90%. And so, very, very likely. But for a while, this was not the case in American history. It's only really been, we've seen this brinkmanship in the last 20 or 30 years. Of course, there was a shutdown very famously in the mid-90s when President Bill Clinton was in office and Republicans led by then Speaker Newt Gingrich controlled the House and also the Senate, and there was a shutdown. But then we went for about, I think, 15 years or so, actually more, until the Obama administration, and there was a couple of shutdowns then. There was a couple of shutdowns in the Trump administration where you had the reverse, a Republican in the White House, Donald Trump, Democrats in control of I think at that time, the House of Representatives. And so the polarization that we've seen in the United States politically is reflected in the Congress. And that's why they can't seem to even keep the government open for more than a year or two at a time.
And Richard, our viewers abroad must wonder, how is it possible the United States can actually shut down? This is almost completely an American phenomenon. What separates us in these sorts of things from other countries around the world?
Well, we're one of the few governments where that's even a possibility, that requires an authorization to spend money that's already been approved legislatively. So it just doesn't come up in most governments.
And when it does happen, what are the implications for workers, for ordinary people? What does it mean?
Well, there have only been 3 government shutdowns that lasted longer than a week. Russell referred to these, and the damage has been de minimis. You know, the impact on GDP has been less than 1 basis point. Markets have reacted in the short term, but shrugged it off a couple of weeks later as if it never happened. There's a lot of temporary inconvenience, especially federal workers who don't get paid. And we had the heartbreaking scene of federal workers actually in food lines in 2018, 2019. But those impacts are short-lived. You know, visitors to national parks show up and the park is closed. You know, there's things like that happen, but generally there's very little impact from these shutdowns.
And just to put our viewers at ease, eventually those workers do get their salary retroactively. Sarah, just to remind our viewers, all this is about 1/3 of the federal budget, the discretionary part of the budget, because 2/3 of the budget is mandated by law and doesn't need annual spending bills. That's the biggest part of the budget. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, workers' compensation. So we're fighting, this whole big fight is about a relatively small part of the federal budget.
Right, that's right. So Congress controls about a little over $1 trillion a year in what you call discretionary spending. That's both the Pentagon and all of the domestic agencies, Veterans Affairs, all that sorts of things. And these are the annual chores that Congress has to do. Both the House and the Senate pass 12 spending bills in theory. That's how they fund the government. Every bill controls various agencies, and they can decide which ones they want to do first, which ones are easier. But there's just been a total breakdown, particularly in the past 15 years or so, where they've just become messaging bills. Essentially, the Republicans and Democrats, if they're in charge of either chamber, they're going to pass the bills that give them points within their own party. They're going to be trying to tuck in their own priorities, and that inevitably leads to the gridlock that we see now. And everything has just become so partisan. And Russell was talking about the brinksmanship. This is just a level that we haven't seen before. The point that we've been making about how shutdowns are becoming more and more common. The last one was 35 days. It cost the government $5 billion. That's according to the Congressional Budget Office. And this is why there's a lot of members who are lawmakers in Congress who are so frustrated by the process. They're looking for ways to get around this, but the way to become a leader in your party is to be very, very partisan, to cater to your own voters back home. And so that's why we've just seen this increased partisanship, and those 12 annual bills are almost never done.
And I know this is getting a bit into the weeds, but in the old days, Russell, Congress could get around the absence of a budget by passing what was called a continuing resolution. And multiple such resolutions get folded into what's called an omnibus bill. But that's a lot tougher to do these days. Why is that?
That's right. You know, Republicans right now are having trouble. They've had trouble passing even an extension of government funding for just 30 days, that in a continuing resolution, as you referred to what the bill is called, on Capitol Hill. So they're not even having trouble passing the full year budget. They're having trouble keeping the government open for another 30 days. And, you know, we've gotten into this pattern as well, where, you know, there have been what's called continuing resolutions for months on end because they can't agree on new spending or sort of a new policy to govern that spending. And so that basically puts the government on autopilot, but it represents the lack of negotiation, real negotiation that happens and has happened in the past before this this sort of period of polarization that we've seen.
So, Richard, you seem to suggest that this wasn't such a huge deal for our national economy, that we're going to get through this, that it's a blip. Does it really matter if the government shuts down for a little while? Does it really matter if our leaders are having such a difficult time approving a federal budget?
Well, it's just an aggressive negotiating tactic, and there's not much economic consequence to it. But I want to put this in a larger context. In the 3 years of the pandemic, federal debt increased by $8 trillion. That's 20 through 22. Household wealth in that period increased by $30 trillion. When government does deficit spending, that money does not disappear. That money ends up in the accounts of households. And in fact, if you look back through time, federal debt to GDP, gross domestic product, was 31% in 1981. Today, it's 121%. Household wealth in that period has gone from 350% of GDP to 600% of GDP. The bottom line here is that government deficit spending creates household wealth. So the underlying premise here that deficits are this terrible thing is simply not true. And certainly a short-term government shutdown is not of any material consequence.
So you're suggesting that what most people tend to think of as a sign of government dysfunction, the inability to get a balanced budget that every American has to do in their own kitchen table, is actually not so bad for the American economy.
Deficit spending creates household wealth. $8 trillion in additional debt in a 3-year period created $30 trillion in more household wealth. I mean, the only caveat to that is most of that wealth goes to the wealthiest. So the top 10% get 80% of that benefit. Nevertheless, the fundamental fact is government deficits and debt create household wealth. And that's a very fundamental truth about the economy that's largely missed in these debates.
And so, Sarah, when you look at what congressmen are saying to each other about whether and how to pass a budget, the orthodoxy is we try to rein in spending as much as possible, isn't it?
Right. And there will be members of Congress who do want to cut spending, but even they point out we're only talking about 1/3 of the government spending overall, as you pointed out. So these fights over the discretionary spending are really not what most members would like to be focused on anyways. They would rather talk about structural reforms to these big programs and that sort of thing. So it's frustrating for a lot of reasons. I mean, there's of course folks who are watching in and just seeing this congressional dysfunction, but also the folks who want to fix some of these problems, who want to change some of the ways that the country does things, are saying, well, this isn't even the mechanism to do that. We're looking at the wrong pot of money.
And when they look at the different pots of money, Russell, what's the politics here?
Well, of course, what's interesting here is that usually the Defense Department, the Pentagon, the troops, the American military, that's usually the easiest department to fund, because nobody, Republican or Democrat, wants to say they wouldn't support the troops. But in fact, the Republicans have even had a hard time in the House passing a funding bill for the Department of Defense. That's how bad things have got when it comes to this sort of dysfunction that we've been talking about. And Democrats classically, they would like to spend more money on on benefits, especially for lower income and middle income people. Republicans want to cut spending. They want to cut spending across the board, but even here they want to cut spending for particular departments. They want to cut spending for the FBI, which is traditionally law enforcement is a community that has a lot of Republican support. But in this case, they think that the FBI is going after Donald Trump and conservatives. And so they want to defund the FBI. And so you have some really interesting kind of wacky, as some people would say, dynamics going on here. And that's added to the complications. Republicans want to spend more money defending, in their words, the southern border because of the crisis where we have migrants coming over the border from Texas, from Mexico into Texas and other border states. They want to spend more money to begin to restart constructing the border wall that Donald Trump made his signature policy initiative. They want to put more border agents down there. And so in some respects, Republicans actually want to spend more money in certain areas like the border while spending less everywhere else.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to look deeper at the relationship between deficit, debt, the American economy, and the politics of all these issues when we come back in just a moment. Again, my guests today include Sarah Ferris. Sarah covers the Congress for Politico, a multimedia platform that is all politics all the time. A native of Newtown, Connecticut, she has also reported for The Hill and The Washington Post. Also with us is Russell Berman. Russell is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers American politics. And with us from Pennsylvania is Richard Vague. Richard is a former Secretary of Banking and Securities for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the author of a new book, The Paradox of Debt, a Wall Street Journal bestseller. All right, Richard, help explain to our viewers abroad something that most Americans don't even understand: the relationship between deficit and debt on the federal level.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. If the existing level of debt is 31 trillion, and we have a deficit during this year of $1.5 trillion, at the end of the year, you add that $1.5 trillion to the debt that needs to be issued. So you now have debt of 32.5 trillion. It's a very linear, very simple relationship. Now, the presumption has been high levels of debt are a terrible thing. But I want to put that in perspective too. US debt now is approaching 33 trillion, but household wealth is 150 trillion. And about 30 trillion of that household wealth is that government debt. If the government did not have 30-something trillion in debt, households would simply be 30 trillion less wealthy.
So this is a bit of what we would call counterintuitive thinking, that debt is good, when most people actually try to stay out of debt as much as possible in their own personal lives. Do you think politicians understand what you're suggesting, Richard?
Not even close. But all this data is in the Federal Reserve and OECD and other data that's provided. This is not some esoteric theory. You know, at the end of 2019, household wealth was, 120 trillion. Today it's 150 trillion. That's not theory. That's the reality of what household wealth is. Most of that wealth is in the form of stocks and real estate.
And Russell, a final word, if you could look into your crystal ball, if we do have a shutdown, how long do you think this one is going to last?
I think it could last, a few weeks. I mean, that's generally, as I think Richard alluded to earlier, that's been the case with the shutdowns. Once they go past 24 or 48 hours, the parties usually retrench for a little bit and go back to their corners, so to speak. And so I think that's probably what we're looking at. But, the longest one, I think, was the one a few years ago that was about a month, and that would be pretty long. And so I would guess a few weeks.
Well, even if the government shuts down, Dakhel Washington will continue to air, and we will continue to provide you with insight into how government works if the government is open. Thank you for joining us, Richard Vague, Russell Berman, and Sarah Ferris, this week on Dakhel Washington. What does Congress do? We all think we know, but do we really? According to the Constitution, Congress has the responsibility for organizing the executive and judicial branches, for raising revenue, that is taxes, for declaring war, and for making all laws necessary for executing these powers. That's it. No more, no less. It doesn't sound like heavy lifting. Doesn't even sound like a full-time job. So why is it that the current Congress has not been able to pass any of the 12 spending bills whose approval is necessary for the functioning of our government? Why is it that Congress's inability to fulfill even this most basic of legislative responsibilities is almost certainly going to lead to a full or at least partial shutdown of the federal government? As an American, I am embarrassed. People around the world look to America as the land of the free, home of the brave, country where the Statue of Liberty stands as beacon of freedom to enslaved people fighting tyranny and equality around the world. But on closer inspection, those same people who look up to us will see an America that allows petty politics to overwhelm the most basic functions of state, with the result that the mighty American government will most likely close its doors on October 1st, with only the most urgent and necessary tasks of government, like law enforcement, guarding prisons, and air traffic control, escaping closure. Now, this is not the first time that government will close. In the past 40 years, we have seen shutdowns under both Democratic and Republican administrations. Republicans forced 2 lengthy shutdowns on Bill Clinton in the 1990s. More recently, Democrats refused to fund Donald Trump's border wall, leading to a 34-day partial shutdown. Normally, there are ways around a shutdown. Many times in recent years, Congress has approved something called a continuing resolution, a CR, that keeps spending at a stable level until a new law is passed, setting new levels for different departments of government. But a law was approved to set overall spending limits earlier in the Biden administration. That law made it more difficult to approve a new resolution because it would trigger an immediate cut in defense spending, and no one wants to go there with a presidential election approaching. So a shutdown is the lesser evil. In my view, there has to be a better way. Congress has operational oversight. It can exert the authority to investigate, and it can wield the power of the purse. But there is nothing to investigate or supervise if the government is shut down. We need bipartisan agreement that Congress will define a time limit for the review, amendment, and approval of spending bills. Otherwise, confidence in the institutions of government will continue to wither and shrink. Presidents have a role to play too. They often produce budgets that are not real. They're just political statements, laundry lists of what they want, not what reflects the hard choices of leadership, and certainly not practical plans to fund government. Here too, enough is enough. I believe that most Congress people actually want to be responsible, that most want to do their jobs and to do what their constituents elected them to do. We have to create the circumstances that allow our representatives to do those jobs, which means we have to insulate them from the worst side of politics that prevents practical, rational governing. Of course, that's easier said than done. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول التأثير الاقتصادي للإغلاق الحكومة الفيدرالية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.